I'm Primal Piggy. Thank you for joining us for another BDSM United podcast in our slave training series. This is a new and improved slave training series, and we've added a lot of new information. Some of it was kind of hard for me to teach, even because it's things that I know about, but it's not always easy for me to teach them. But it definitely gives you some ideas of things for you to look into as you develop your master slave relationship and as you develop your training process. Today, let's talk about contracts. The major purpose of a slave contract is to define the goals and set the standards that are expected of a slave and to establish the responsibilities of the master. I'm going to repeat that because that's pretty important. Is that the purpose of a slave contract? It is to define the goals and it sets the expected standards of a slave, but it also establishes the responsibilities of the master to the slave. A slave contract is not a legally binding contract. It's not going to hold up in court in most countries, and that's really not its purpose. But it's a symbolic representation of the commitment for both the master and the slave. And the contracts within BDSM are important communication tools. Um, Within the BDSM community, the slave contract is considered an important document, and it should only be approached if both the master and the slave are serious and committed to the future. A slave contract is to be entered into with the informed consent of both parties. The slave contract reflects what's expected in the re education and the re socialization of the slave. Generally, slave contracts are more detailed in the early stages of training, and then they're oftentimes rewritten a little bit later as the slave is molded into the image and the likeness of the master, and usually there's somewhat of a training contract and then a more formal contract following. The details in earlier slave contracts help guide both the master and the slave in the right direction. Now, slave contracts don't define how a slave is to act all of the time. They're not generally micromanaging contracts, but instead they provide general concepts because a lot of times in MS, once the slave is trained, the slave just instinctively knows the master and knows how to please and serve and obey the master and knows what it should do at all times in order to please the master. So it's often refers to rules and guidelines that will be set by the master that are independent of the contract itself. The slave contract is a permanent document that really doesn't change very much over time. However, rules and guidelines may change. Oftentimes, a slave contract is a future oriented document. The intent of the slave contract is to explain what is expected both of the master and the slave in the future. And the freedoms given to the slave by the master should be clearly defined in the slave contract and understood by the slave. There really is no reason not to freely discuss the slave contract. There's no reason that it should not be understood by the slave. There's no reason not to freely discuss it with the trainee before both sign the document. Now, oftentimes, though they don't change a lot, oftentimes they'll be revisited at different, maybe yearly or every 3 years or whatnot, because you don't always know what the future holds, and you don't know what things may change or be added to just culture in general. For instance, someone in the '60s who signed a slave contract may not know that in the 90s that personal computers would even be a thing, or internet connections would even be a thing, or online types of communication would be so prevalent. And so at some point they may update it to include things that deal with computers and online things. A slave contract must be realistic to have any real value to the parties who sign one. There are many examples of contracts on the internet, so yeah, be sure that you read several, and you really need to prepare your own based upon your own lifestyle. While you can model yours after someone else's, it definitely needs to be personalized. Each party entering a relationship has expectations and desires. Make sure the contract meets as much as possible of the desires of both you, the master, and the slave. Make sure you want to own or to be a slave before you even consider signing a contract. You really need to have a realistic view. That's oftentimes why perhaps a more temporary training contract needs to be signed first, and then a more formal one later, because you're not going to know what you don't know until you know what you don't know. Let me repeat that. You're not going to know what you don't know until you know what you don't know. So you're not going to even know whether you definitely want to be a slave, or that you definitely want to own a slave, until you're into the process itself. And when you first do a contract, you may make it very complex and cover many issues in great detail. The truth is, you can use a very general slave contract. So oftentimes, you may come up with something that's really big and bulky. It's best probably to trim it down, to edit it down to something that's a little more general. You'll find that you need a living, breathing document that grows with you. Many find that a general contract really works better than a detailed one. And something I would say is that you want this to be more of a vision statement than a rules based statement. You want this to kind of uh, tell your story, and kind of set your goals, and kind of set you on a mission or a direction, more so than rules and guidelines and things. So an owner's manual or a house manual oftentimes fulfills that purpose rather than a contract. Some basic elements you should consider when preparing a slave contract. Well, you definitely want the names of the parties involved and their role or their identity in the relationship, along with your titles such as master and slave. You definitely want to include the period of the slave's service, the beginning of the contract terms, the period of service. It may be lifelong, or you may want to uh, you know set it for a different time frame. It's really up to you. The conditions of slavery, uh, domination and submission, extent and rules and duties, different types of punishments. You want to include the limitations to the master's authority. Oftentimes, most in MS relationships, most of the slaves don't have limits. They generally share the limits of the master, but oftentimes it is the master's choice. The master can give any limits that he wants to, or afford any limits he wants to his slave. So any limits or safe words and how they're applied. Example perhaps would be to not do bodily harm or destroy a certain family relationship. The slave, whether you give the slave rights for free time or periods of open communication. Sometimes some people can have what they call porch time. They call it different in different relationships, where they can step out of the MS role to briefly talk about concerns and things, or they can petition, sorry, to step outside of the MS role temporarily for just a few moments to talk about things in in a more autonomous, equal way, just for a period of time. So if that's something that interests you as a master and you want to write that into your contract, that would be important. And how to terminate the contract, how and who can terminate the relationship, and why it can be ended. If the proper period of time the contract covers before being renewed or canceled, you know, uh, you want to definitely tell how the contract is terminated or how the relationship can end. You definitely want to give yourself a path out, though you may never take it, may never want to take it. You definitely want to put it in there so that nobody is hurt in the process, if it ever should end. The oath and the signatures of parties and oftentimes witnesses. It's definitely good not to always have your relationship in isolation, but also to get the advice and counsel and be involved in BDSM in the local community as well to some degree. So, witnesses that sign it and date it, it helps add formality to it, and it helps um, give an air of accountability. The slave contract serves as a reminder that the slave is the owned property of the master. The slave contract serves as a reminder to the slave of the freedoms it has delivered to its master. It also is a reminder to the master of his responsibilities to his slave. The signing of a contract, again, it can't be a forced act. It's a consensual document, and it really needs to be clearly understood. So if you're using language that one person doesn't understand, definitely need to rewrite it or explain it or teach it so that both people can consensually understand it and make an informed consensual decision about signing it. Before the actual signing of the contract, that's when it's the right time to ask questions, to get answers, to make sure that all the vetting and negotiations have been done before you go and sign such an important document, because you're really signing something. You're giving your word, and your word should matter in this lifestyle. I'm Primal Piggy. Thank you for joining me for this BDSM United podcast in our slave training series. All of our resources online are easily accessible on www.bdsmunited.com. Leave us a like, a review, a comment. Tell us what you think. This helps us connect, or helps you connect with us, but it also helps other adults find these BDSM educational resources. And when our others in our community are educated, it makes our whole entire community better. So thank you for playing your part in that. It's been a joy talking to you today, and I'll talk to you again soon.